Years later, no one remembered what the room used to be. A pale armchair sat by the window, collecting dust like forgotten promises. The wallpaper had faded from cheerful yellow to the color of old parchment, but behind those peeling edges lay a quiet legacy that once mattered deeply to someone who no longer lived there. Eleanor James had once called it home, a corner of the lakefront house. She helped build with her own hands and her own money, every nail and board chosen with the care of someone who believed she was creating something permanent. The room held traces of her presence, like archaeological evidence of a vanished civilization. A small reading lamp positioned just so to catch the morning light. Custom-built shelves that perfectly fit her collection of architecture books. A heating vent redirected to keep the space warmer, because her arthritis made cold mornings unbearable. These details spoke of someone who had planned to stay, who had invested not just money, but hope in making this space truly her own. But now the room was silent, stripped of personality and purpose. Her suitcase, once wedged under the guest bed, with the resigned acceptance of someone who knew she was tolerated rather than welcomed, had long since disappeared, along with everything else that marked her time there. The closet stood empty except for wire hangers that clinked softly. When the house settled, a hollow sound that seemed to echo her absence. The transformation had been gradual, then sudden. First, her books were relocated to make room for wedding presents that needed temporary storage. Then her favorite chair was moved to the basement because it clashed with the new decor. Her personal photographs found themselves relegated to a drawer, replaced by generic artwork that matched the living room palette. Each change was presented as reasonable, temporary, necessary, but Eleanor had learned to read the subtext, written in her daughter's increasingly impatient sighs. When Eleanor left without a word on the night before her daughter, Lindsay's wedding, no one asked where she went. They assumed she had finally done what they silently wished, disappeared quietly, conveniently, without making a scene that might complicate their carefully orchestrated celebration. The wedding proceeded as planned, the reception flowed seamlessly, and the guests never knew that the woman who had funded their elegant evening was sleeping in a roadside inn 20 miles away, staring at water stains on the ceiling and wondering how her generosity had transformed into such profound loneliness. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, in their relief at her absence was that Eleanor had taken more with her than a suitcase and wounded pride. She had taken the truth, documented in photocopies and legal papers, that she had quietly secured weeks earlier. When the pattern of her erasure became undeniable, the house they celebrated in, the wedding they danced at, the future they planned together, all of it rested on foundations that Eleanor had helped lay, both literally and financially. The guest room might have forgotten her, but the law had not. Her name remained on deeds and contracts, her investments recorded in documents that couldn't be wished away or redecorated. While they celebrated her absence, Eleanor was finally, for the first time in years, planning her return to a life where she wouldn't need permission to exist in her own space. The pale armchair by the window might sit empty now, but it would not remain a monument to her disappearance. Soon it would become evidence of something far more powerful. The moment when a woman who had been slowly erased decided to write herself back into her own story. Years before the silence settled like dust over the empty guest room, Eleanor was a newly retired architect with silver hair that caught the light like spun metal, quiet hands that still remembered the weight of blueprints, and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 4 decades, spent designing spaces where people could truly live. Her daughter Lindsay had been eager to start a new life. With Caleb, their relationship still wrapped in the golden glow of early love and shared dreams that seemed both infinite and urgent. When they found the fixer-upper by the lake, it was everything young couples convince themselves they want: charming bones beneath neglect, potential, hiding under peeling paint, and a price that seemed almost too good to be true. The reality, of course, was far more complex. The foundation needed reinforcing. The electrical system was a fire hazard waiting to happen, and the plumbing groaned with decades of deferred maintenance. But Lindsay and Caleb saw only possibility, the way young people do when they believe love can overcome any obstacle. It was Eleanor who stepped in with the practical expertise they lacked, armed with architectural training and the hard-won knowledge that dreams require both vision and engineering. She spent weeks walking through the property, making notes in her precise handwriting, calculating load-bearing requirements and drainage solutions. She designed not just renovations but transformations, turning cramped spaces into flowing rooms, that would welcome both solitude and celebration. More importantly, she financed their vision when banks looked at their combined income and debt-to-income ratio and politely declined their loan applications. Eleanor wrote the check for $95,000 without hesitation, watching their faces light up with gratitude and possibility. The money represented years of careful saving, the accumulated reward of a career spent designing buildings that would outlast their creators. She could have bought herself a comfortable retirement home in a planned community with golf courses and scheduled activities. Instead, she chose to invest in her daughter's future. But Eleanor's contribution went far beyond financial support. She moved into the guest room with the quiet joy of someone who had spent too many years alone in an apartment that echoed with emptiness. Every brushstroke on the wall carried her careful attention to color and light. Every custom shelf was measured precisely to fit the space and the books that would fill it. Every polished floorboard reflected hours of work that were as much meditation as labor. She planted roses by the front door, choosing varieties that would bloom in succession from spring through fall, ensuring the entrance would always welcome visitors with color and fragrance. She installed window boxes and planned a garden that would provide both beauty and privacy. These were not the gestures of someone helping temporarily. They were the choices of someone building a permanent home. For months, the arrangement felt like the answer to prayers no one had dared to voice. Lindsay and Caleb had the house they wanted and the expertise they needed. Eleanor had the family proximity she craved and the sense of purpose that retirement had stolen from her. The three of them worked side by side, stripping wallpaper and installing fixtures, sharing meals on sawhorses that served as temporary tables, planning room layouts late into the evening. Then came the wedding planning, and Eleanor's retirement fund began to shrink with alarming speed, as each payment carved away another chunk of her carefully accumulated security. The florist required a deposit that could have covered Eleanor's groceries for 6 months. The venue demanded payment schedules that assumed unlimited resources. The photographer's fees reflected the assumption that memories were priceless and therefore immune to budget constraints. At first, they called her generous, praising her willingness to make their celebration possible. Lindsay would hug her with tears of gratitude, marveling at how lucky she was to have a mother who understood the importance of starting marriage with a perfect celebration. Caleb would thank her awkwardly but sincerely, clearly uncomfortable with the scale of her financial contribution, but unwilling to suggest alternatives that might diminish their planned festivities. But generosity, Eleanor discovered, has a shelf life. As the months passed and the wedding expenses mounted, gratitude began to curdle into expectation. Her suggestions about budget-friendly alternatives were dismissed as evidence that she didn't understand the importance of the occasion. Her gentle questions about costs were met with eye rolls and impatient explanations about how weddings work in the modern world. She noticed the way Lindsay's voice changed when she spoke to her, developing an edge of irritation that suggested Eleanor's presence had become more burden than blessing. She saw how Caleb stopped asking for her opinion about renovation decisions, consulting online forums and home improvement shows instead of drawing on her professional expertise. The house was becoming theirs in ways that gradually excluded her, despite her financial and creative investment in its transformation. The shift was subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. Rooms she had designed were rearranged without consultation. Her suggestions about landscaping were politely ignored. Her offers to help with wedding details were deflected with explanations about how they needed to handle things themselves, as if her assistance had somehow become inappropriate interference rather than welcome support. Eleanor found herself walking on eggshells in a house she had helped create, monitoring her words and actions, to avoid triggering the impatience that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface of every interaction. She no longer belonged, not really, despite the legal documents that still listed her as a co-owner, and the bank statements that documented her investment in their shared future. The final blow came wrapped in politeness so careful it felt more insulting than honest anger would have been. A subtle suggestion that she might want to find somewhere else to stay during the wedding weekend. Just for the weekend, they assured her, to give the wedding party space to get ready without crowding. But Eleanor heard what they didn't say: this was no longer her home, and her presence had become an inconvenience to be managed rather than a contribution to be valued. Standing in the guest room that night, surrounded by the evidence of her careful investment in their happiness, Eleanor finally understood the true cost of her generosity. She had given them not just money and expertise, but also the power to erase her from the life she had helped them build. At the small inn on the edge of town, Eleanor sat in a chair that smelled faintly of cigarettes and industrial cleaning solution, surrounded by the kind of generic decor that suggested no one was expected to stay long enough to notice its inadequacies. The room was a study in beige functionality polyester curtains that blocked most, but not all of the parking lot lights. A television bolted to the wall at an angle that guaranteed neck strain, and a bathroom with fixtures that had seen better decades. But it was hers for as long as she needed. It, paid for with her own credit card, free from the suffocating politeness that had made her feel like a ghost in her own investment. On the narrow desk that wobbled slightly when she rested her arms on it, Eleanor opened a weathered manila envelope with fingers that trembled not from age but from anticipation. The envelope had been waiting in her car for weeks, prepared during those long afternoons when she had begun to understand that gratitude has an expiration date, and generosity can become a weapon against the giver. Inside were photocopies, contracts, and titles, all the things they had conveniently forgotten she had signed when their need was urgent. And her help seemed like salvation rather than interference. The documents told a story that contradicted the narrative of charity and burden that had gradually replaced the earlier language of partnership and investment. Her name appeared on deed transfers, loan applications, and ownership documents, with the clear authority of someone who had not given a gift but made a calculated financial commitment. She was still listed as a 35% owner of the home, a legal reality that transformed her from unwelcome guest to displaced property owner, with rights that could not be wished away by impatient sighs and gentle suggestions about alternative living arrangements. The down payment had not been a gift, despite how they had chosen to remember it. The legal documents made that distinction clear with the kind of precise language that architects and lawyers both appreciate. It was an investment legally and emotionally in a shared future that she had helped design from foundation to finish. Her professional expertise, her financial resources, and her physical labor had all been documented and recorded, creating a paper trail that told the true story of the lakefront house they now considered entirely their own. Eleanor spread the papers across the inn's small table, like an architect reviewing blueprints, seeing in the legal language the structure of rights and responsibilities that had been obscured by months of gradual erasure. The contracts specified not just financial obligations, but decision-making authority, maintenance responsibilities, and occupancy rights that had been systematically ignored, as her daughter and son-in-law had rewritten the terms of their arrangement without bothering to consult the actual agreements. The next morning brought the first test of her newfound clarity about her legal position. The venue called with the cheerful efficiency of a business that had received several payments on schedule and expected the pattern to continue. The reception Eleanor had paid for was scheduled for that weekend, they reminded her, and they needed confirmation of final details and the remaining balance. The caller seemed surprised when Eleanor informed them that the event was canceled, effective immediately, and that she would be requesting a refund of all payments made to date according to their cancellation policy. The venue's confusion was nothing compared to the panic that followed. The couple's frantic phone calls began within the hour, their voices tight with disbelief and growing desperation. How could she cancel their wedding reception? What about the guests who had already made travel plans? What about the deposits and the planning? And the expectations of everyone who had been invited to celebrate their new beginning? But Eleanor had moved beyond the reach of their emotional manipulation. She had spent months absorbing their disappointment in her presence, their frustration with her suggestions, and their obvious relief when she made herself scarce. She had learned that generosity without boundaries becomes servitude, and that gratitude unexpressed transforms into entitlement. The venue cancellation was not revenge. It was simply the withdrawal of financial support that had never been appreciated and had gradually become expected rather than acknowledged. When they tried to accuse her of mental instability, suggesting to concerned relatives and family friends that grief or age or loneliness had compromised her judgment, Eleanor was prepared. The welfare check they requested only confirmed what she already knew about herself. She was sharper than ever, more focused than she had been in years, and finally clear about the difference between helping someone and enabling their exploitation of her resources and goodwill. The investigating officer found Eleanor in her in-room, surrounded by organized documents and legal papers, able to explain her situation with the kind of detailed precision that comes from professional training and careful preparation. She could account for every dollar she had spent, every decision she had made, and every legal right she was asserting. Her explanation was coherent, her documentation was thorough, and her mental state was demonstrably sound. The officer's report reflected what Eleanor had known all along. There was nothing unstable about a woman protecting her financial interests and asserting her legal rights. They had not just forgotten their obligations to acknowledge her contributions and respect her partnership in the house's transformation. They had rewritten history itself, casting her as the villain in a story she had helped write, the burden in a narrative where she had been the solution to problems they could not have solved without her expertise and resources. Their version of events required Eleanor to be either mentally incompetent or maliciously vindictive, because acknowledging her actual role would mean admitting how thoroughly they had taken advantage of her generosity. But Eleanor was not angry, not in the way they expected or perhaps hoped. Anger would have been easier to dismiss, easier to pathologize, easier to use as evidence of her alleged instability. Instead, she was awake fully, completely, devastatingly awake for the first time in years. She saw clearly how she had allowed her desire to help to become a pattern of enabling, how her love for her daughter had been transformed into a resource, to be mined rather than a relationship to be cherished. The papers spread across the end table represented more than legal documentation. They were evidence of her own value, proof that her contributions had been real and substantial and worthy of respect. For months, she had been made to feel like her presence was a burden and her assistance was interference. Now, surrounded by contracts and titles and ownership documents, she remembered who she was, not a charity case or a dependent relative, but an accomplished professional who had made strategic investments in what she had believed would be a mutually beneficial partnership. The transformation was not dramatic or sudden, but it was complete. Eleanor James, architect and investor, had spent enough time being treated as Eleanor James, inconvenient elderly relative. The documents on the table gave her the legal foundation to reclaim not just her financial interests, but her dignity and her right to be treated as an equal partner in decisions that affected her own future. The silence between them was deeper now, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things never said, full of the weight of assumptions that had crumbled under the pressure of legal reality. Eleanor had spent 3 sleepless nights in the in-room, surrounded by documents that told the truth her family had chosen to forget, while her phone buzzed with increasingly desperate messages that she chose not to answer. The sound of their panic felt different from this. Distance less urgent, more predictable, like the inevitable consequence of choices they had made without considering the cost. Eleanor didn't want revenge, though she understood why they might interpret her actions that way. Revenge implied anger hot enough to cloud judgment, a desire to inflict pain proportional to pain received. What she felt was something colder and cleaner clarity. For the first time in months, she could see the situation without the distorting lens of her own need to be needed, her own willingness to sacrifice her comfort for the illusion of being valued. The venue cancellation hadn't been vindictive, it had been practical. Why should she continue funding a celebration from which she had been effectively excluded? The attorney's office smelled like leather and old wood polish, with the kind of understated elegance that suggested competence without ostentation. Eleanor had chosen her lawyer carefully, a woman about her own age, with silver hair and steady eyes, who specialized in elder law and family property disputes. She had no patience for the kind of emotional manipulation that Eleanor had been subjected to for months, and her questions cut straight to the legal and financial facts that would determine Eleanor's options. In the polished leather chair across from the mahogany desk, Eleanor laid out her terms with the same methodical precision she had once used to design buildings that would outlast their creators. Her voice was calm, her documentation comprehensive, and her requests reasonable given the circumstances. She wanted either a buyout that reflected her actual investment in the property, or a sale that would allow all parties to walk away with their fair share of the proceeds. If Lindsay and Caleb wanted to keep the house they had helped her create, they would need to demonstrate the kind of financial responsibility and personal respect that should have been part of their arrangement from the beginning. The numbers were stark when presented without the cushioning of family sentiment. Eleanor's $95,000 investment, combined with her additional expenditures on renovations, landscaping, and wedding costs, represented a substantial portion of her retirement savings. Her 35% ownership stake in a property that had appreciated significantly during the renovation process meant that any buyout would need to reflect both her initial investment and the current market value of her share. Lindsay and Caleb arrived at the attorney's office, shell-shocked and desperate, their faces carrying the stunned expression of people who had suddenly discovered that legal documents mean exactly what they say. They had brought their own representation, a younger lawyer who seemed uncomfortable with the straightforward nature of Eleanor's claims. There was nothing to dispute. Really, the paperwork was clear. Eleanor's investments were documented, and her ownership rights were legally unambiguous. The couple tried to offer excuses, explanations that revealed how thoroughly they had rewritten the history of their arrangement. They spoke of Eleanor's generosity as if it had been charity rather than investment, of her presence in their home, as if it had been temporary assistance rather than legitimate occupancy by a co-owner. They seemed genuinely surprised that she expected to be treated as an equal partner in decisions about a property she had helped purchase and improve. But Eleanor didn't need apologies anymore. Not the kind of hollow expressions of regret that were designed to restore the status quo rather than address the underlying issues. She needed boundaries clear, legally enforceable boundaries that would prevent future misunderstandings about her role and her rights. And maybe, just maybe, she needed to forgive herself for allowing things to get this far. Without speaking up, for prioritizing harmony over honesty until the silence became unbearable. The negotiations took several hours, punctuated by whispered conferences between the couple and their attorney, frantic phone calls to banks about loan possibilities, in the kind of careful calculations that revealed just how precarious their financial situation had become without Eleanor's steady support. They had been living beyond their means, sustained by her contributions, and the sudden withdrawal of that safety net exposed vulnerabilities they had been able to ignore while she quietly covered the shortfalls. Eleanor watched their distress with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't satisfaction either. She had no desire to see them fail, but she also couldn't continue enabling their failure to take responsibility for their own choices. The house they wanted to keep represented not just shelter, but status, not just investment, but identity. Losing it would mean acknowledging that their dreams had been bigger than their resources, their plans more ambitious than their preparation. The final agreement required them to secure a loan that would buy out Eleanor's share within 6 months, with specific provisions about what would happen if they failed to meet that deadline. The terms were fair but firm, designed to protect Eleanor's interest while giving them a reasonable opportunity to keep the home they had come to see as entirely their own. The contract included clauses about future communication, decision-making authority during the transition period, and consequences for failure to meet the agreed-upon timeline. It took weeks of frantic activity on their part, budgeting with the kind of precision they should have been using all along. Job applications that reflected a new urgency about income. Intense check-ins with loan officers who wanted to see evidence of financial stability rather than optimistic projections about future earnings. But something began to shift during those weeks. Something that suggested the crisis might have served as the wake-up call they had needed, but been too comfortable to heed while Eleanor's support cushioned them from consequences. Lindsay found work at a design firm, swallowing her pride about the entry-level position and focusing on the steady paycheck rather than the job title. Caleb started picking up weekend jobs that supplemented his regular income, trading leisure time for the financial security they needed to qualify for the loan. The spending stopped. No more impulse purchases, no more assumptions that money would somehow appear when needed. The blaming faded too, replaced by the kind of focused problem-solving that comes from accepting responsibility, rather than looking for someone else to shoulder it. Eleanor found herself breathing easier as she watched these changes unfold. Not because she took pleasure in their struggle, but because their efforts represented the respect for her investment and her judgment that had been missing from their relationship. They were finally treating her as a partner rather than a resource, consulting her about decisions rather than informing her about choices they had already made. The transformation wasn't complete or permanent. Old habits die hard, and financial stress can bring out the worst in people as easily as the best. But for the first time in months, Eleanor could see the possibility of a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided generosity. The legal framework they had established created space for rebuilding trust, if they chose to do the work that trust required. By the end of the 6th month, they had secured the loan and met their obligation to buy out Eleanor's share. The transaction was completed with the kind of professional courtesy that had replaced the earlier family drama, and Eleanor found herself holding a check that represented not just financial compensation, but vindication of her worth as both investor and family member. 6 months later, Eleanor was no longer a shadow in someone else's house, no longer carefully monitoring her footsteps to avoid the creaks that might announce her unwelcome presence. She lived in a bright two-bedroom apartment in a senior eco-village on the other side of town, where morning walks led through carefully planned pathways to sunlit community gardens and soft jazz played on Sunday mornings in the common areas. The transition had not been immediate or easy, but it had been hers to make on her own terms, funded by the buyout that acknowledged her actual worth rather than accepting her diminished status as an inconvenience. The apartment reflected her architectural sensibilities in ways the guest room never had. Clean lines and deliberate spaces created flow between the living areas, while large windows maximized the natural light that had been filtered through heavy curtains in her former temporary home. She had chosen every piece of furniture, every color on the walls, every plant that lined the windows. There were no compromises born of someone else's taste, no accommodations to preferences that had never included her input. The space was entirely hers, designed for someone who intended to stay. The eco-village itself represented a different model of aging than the one that had been imposed on her. Here, residents were expected to contribute their skills and expertise to the community, rather than quietly fade into managed irrelevance. Eleanor found herself serving on the architectural committee, reviewing proposals for community improvements and consulting on renovations that would make the spaces more accessible without sacrificing their aesthetic appeal. Her professional knowledge was valued, her opinions sought, and her experience respected by people who understood that aging meant accumulated wisdom rather than diminished capacity. The community garden became her particular passion, a place where she could apply her understanding of design, principles to the living systems that had always fascinated her. She planned beds that balanced color and texture throughout the growing seasons, designed irrigation systems that maximized water efficiency, and created seating areas where residents could rest while tending their plots. The work satisfied something in her that had been dormant during her months of enforced idleness, the deep pleasure of creating something beautiful and functional that would outlast its creator. Lindsay called one day in late spring, not for help with a crisis or to request financial assistance, but to suggest they meet for lunch. The invitation came without the undertone of desperation that had characterized their recent interactions, without the careful manipulation that had made Eleanor feel like a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. It was a simple request, remarkable in its ordinariness, from someone who seemed to be learning the difference between asking for help and demanding it. They met in a small cafe halfway between their respective lives, a neutral territory that belonged to neither of them and carried no history of conflict or disappointment. The restaurant was modest but cheerful, with mismatched furniture and locally sourced ingredients that suggested authenticity rather than pretension. Eleanor arrived first, choosing a table by the window where she could watch the street life while she waited, feeling none of the anxiety that had once accompanied every interaction with her daughter. Lindsay looked different, older perhaps, but also steadier, as if the months of financial responsibility had given her a gravity that had been missing during the years, when Eleanor's support had cushioned her from consequences. She addressed simply, without the designer labels that had once been funded by Eleanor's generosity, and her manner carried the kind of careful attention that comes from people who have learned to value what they have rather than constantly reaching for what they want. The conversation began tentatively, with the kind of careful politeness that replaces intimacy when trust has been damaged but not necessarily destroyed. They talked about work, Lindsay's progress at the design firm where she had started as an entry-level employee, but was beginning to earn recognition for her creativity and reliability. They discussed practical matters, the house maintenance that she and Caleb were now handling themselves, the budget they had created to ensure they could meet their loan payments, the small improvements they were making within their actual means rather than their aspirational ones. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic scene of forgiveness and renewed closeness. Neither of them seemed to want or expect the kind of Hollywood moment that would instantly restore their relationship to some imagined perfect state. Instead, they offered each other something more valuable, the possibility of rebuilding their connection on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than unacknowledged dependence. Eleanor found herself sharing details about her new life, the community garden where she was experimenting with heirloom vegetables, the architectural committee where her expertise was appreciated, the classes she was taking in the sustainable design that kept her mind engaged with current developments in her field. She spoke not to make Lindsay feel guilty about what she had lost, but to demonstrate that her life had expanded rather than contracted, since she had stopped trying to make herself small enough to fit into spaces where she wasn't truly welcome. Lindsay listened with what seemed like genuine interest, asking questions that suggested she was beginning to see her mother as someone with her own goals and interests, rather than someone whose primary purpose was supporting Lindsay's ambitions. She shared her own struggles and discoveries, the satisfaction of earning money through her own efforts, the pride in maintaining the house without relying on her mother's expertise and financial backing, the growing confidence that came from proving to herself that she could handle adult responsibilities. The lunch lasted 2 hours, but it felt neither rushed nor artificially extended. They talked easily about neutral topics, carefully around more sensitive ones, and honestly about their hopes for rebuilding trust between them. When they parted, there were no dramatic gestures or emotional proclamations, just a tentative agreement to meet again in a few weeks and see how they both felt about continuing the conversation. Eleanor walked back to her car with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Not because the relationship was restored that would take much longer, if it ever happened, completely, but because she had finally stopped accepting the role of grateful suppliant in her own family. She was no longer trying to earn love through financial contribution or professional expertise. She was simply herself, a woman with her own life, her own interests, and her own standards for how she deserved to be treated. The roses Eleanor had planted by the lakefront house no longer bloomed under her care, but she had planted new ones in different soil, on her own terms. Some things she had learned must be let go, not because they are unimportant, but because holding on to them prevents the growth of something healthier. Other relationships and commitments could be nurtured again, but only if both parties were willing to do the work that genuine partnership required. The cost of silence had been high, months of feeling erased, years of accumulated resentment, and the painful discovery that generosity without boundaries enables exploitation rather than fostering gratitude. But the reward of speaking up, of stepping back into her own life, with clear expectations and firm boundaries, was proving to be worth every uncomfortable conversation and every moment of uncertainty about the future. As she drove back to the eco-village, Eleanor reflected on the garden metaphor that had become central to her new understanding of relationships. Some plants thrive only when given space to grow independently. Others benefit from careful pruning that removes what is dead or diseased to make room for new growth. The key is knowing which is which and having the patience to tend what can be saved while having the wisdom to compost what cannot.